My narcissistic mom abandoned me as a teen for her boyfriend, who later left her. Now she wants to get back in contact because she's lonely and mad that I'm keeping her far away from my family. I, 25F, haven't been in touch with my mom for the last 5 years because she kicked me out when I was 20 to accommodate her new boyfriend. My mom's ex-boyfriend at the time, let's call him Rick, was a total gold digger, and he didn't even hide it. My mom had been seeing Rick for about 3 months before she brought him home, and like the idiot that she is, she didn't even bother telling him that she had a daughter before bringing him over. My mom is 50 now, and at the time she was nearly 45, but told everybody she wasn't a day older than 40. It was a blatant lie, but she covered it up well with fillers and Botox. I don't know exactly how old Rick was. He must have been in his early to mid-30s, but no older than that, and he was moderately attractive. My mom is also pretty attractive for her age, so at first I thought they were a perfect match. But it wasn't until he opened his mouth and started talking about how great it was that my mom had so much money that I started to question things. He said that he liked the fact that she was a strong, independent, rich woman, and that's what made him want to be with her. I know that's what he said, but our massive house, spacious living room, and very obviously expensive decoration are probably what really made him want to be with my mom. It's no big secret that my mom was rich, but only because she had been left a lot of money by her parents. She was an heiress, and that was pretty much all she was. She had no career of her own, so while the rich part might have been true, I couldn't see how he thought she was strong or independent. She hadn't had to do a single thing in her life. Her parents had built a company from scratch and made her rich, but after they passed away, the company went to her uncle, and he had been running it ever since. She had absolutely nothing to do with how the company operated and had no interest in learning how to run it because, as long as she got the money she was supposed to, she didn't care about anything else. She mostly had hobbies, but she never did anything with passion or focus to turn them into a real career. And that goes for motherhood as well, because I'm pretty sure I was just a hobby for her. She was probably just bored, and I know for a fact that had it not been for her boredom, I wouldn't even have been born. She definitely would have terminated the pregnancy. So I'm kind of lucky that my mother is flighty and indecisive because that's actually what led to me being born. I'm also lucky that my grandparents, unlike her, were decent people and raised me in her absence. My mom probably got bored of being pregnant midway and decided she wasn't interested in being a mother. So after I was born, she pretty much left me with my grandparents most of the time and spent the majority of her time partying or hanging out with her friends. No joke, as a child, I literally thought my grandparents were my parents. I have no idea who my father is because my mom got pregnant after a one-night stand and didn't have any way to contact him, so she didn't. My grandparents, at least, were loving people and never made me feel the absence of my parents. I'd never known my dad, and my mom had never allowed me to get to know her. So I basically only had my grandparents, and I was content with it for a while. But then my grandma passed away when I was in my junior year, and a couple of years later, my grandfather followed. I was heartbroken because I felt like I had lost the only people who cared about me, but thankfully I still had my uncle, and he did look out for me. Granted, he and I were never as close as I was to my grandparents, and we didn't talk often, but he told me he would be there for me, and he really lived up to it. I had never lived with my grandparents permanently. I had always lived with my mom, but I would visit them every weekend. My mom would barely even be home most of the day, so I was okay being alone after school. It gave me a lot of time to finish my homework and do whatever I wanted around the house. After my grandparents passed away, I moved to college, but I would come back home at least once a month and for the holidays. It wasn't because I wanted to stay in touch with my mother, but mostly because I wanted the comfort of my own home. That was it. If anything, my mom's presence was something I had to put up with whenever I came back. My mom had stayed the same my entire life, a shallow and self-centered narcissist, a socialite who cared about very little in the world. She remained the same throughout my life, so she was pretty predictable to me. She had had several boyfriends, but predictably enough, she could never make any of them last. Sometimes it was because they were insecure about her amazing social life, and other times it was because she got bored with them and dumped them without caring about their feelings. I had met several of her boyfriends, and every time they would break up, I could hear the screaming and shouting from my room since it was just above the living room. Never once did she try to make anybody stay because I guess she never cared enough about any of them. But the first time that I couldn't predict anything was when she started dating Rick. With him, everything was different, and it was crazy that she wasn't able to sniff out that he was a gold digger because she was usually great at spotting those things. I mentioned earlier that my mother brought him home for the first time after dating him for 3 months, and it just so happened to be the weekend I was there. So when Rick saw me, and I greeted him out of politeness, he seemed really confused because he hadn't expected me. Only then did my mom tell him that she had a daughter, and he seemed really put off by that, but that was only for a second, and then he went back to his usual charming self. But I could see through him instantly. I could tell that he wasn't interested in my mom, he was just there for the money, and he made it very obvious throughout dinner. He just couldn't stop talking about how great it was that he had found such a beautiful and independent woman, and how impressed she was with him to get her to date him. I knew he was trying to flatter her, and it was working. He put special emphasis on how rich my mother was because that seemed to impress him the most. Honestly, he couldn't have been more obvious if he tried. After we finished dinner, my mom told me that she had invited him to stay with us for a couple of weeks because he had just been laid off at work and he needed a place to stay before his landlord evicted him. Suddenly, it all made sense. He only needed a place to crash, and my mom was his meal ticket. I wanted to warn my mom, but I usually never commented on her relationships because I thought she knew what she was doing. Also, we didn't have that kind of relationship where I could talk comfortably about these things, so I didn't say anything. I wanted to give Rick the benefit of the doubt, not knowing that this decision would end up backfiring badly. A couple of weeks passed, and I didn't go back home until the next month. My mom and I didn't stay in touch while I was at college, so I had no idea how things with her and Rick were going. But when I came back home the next month, I realized that Rick had practically turned my mother's house into his own bachelor pad. Everything was a mess, but my mom told me not to worry because the housekeeper would have everything cleaned up by the next morning. It was fair, but my mom had always been a bit of a neat freak, so it was surprising that she was allowing all of this. I didn't say anything about it because, once again, I didn't think it was my place to comment. Rick and I didn't have any interactions that weekend, and I barely even left my room. Just like every other weekend before that, I only came back home for 2 days, and I had no intention of speaking to anyone. I stayed out of everyone's way and minded my own business. The only time I went downstairs was for meals, and even then, I just took my food and went back to my room to eat by myself. Let me make it very clear. Throughout the weekend, I hadn't even spoken to Rick, but for some reason, he still had a problem with it and didn't like the fact that I had come back home. The day I was supposed to leave, my mom came into my room and told me that she wanted to talk to me about something important. That was surprising because usually my mom and I had nothing to talk about, so I knew it could only be bad news. And it was. She told me that she would appreciate it if I didn't come back home after that month because apparently Rick didn't feel comfortable having me around. He said that he just wanted the two of them, and I had completely ruined the vibe by being there for the weekend. Apparently, he thought he and my mom needed some time to focus on their relationship, and I wasn't helping. My mom agreed with him and told me to find somewhere else to stay when I came home next. I was upset, of course, but I didn't say anything because I knew she wasn't going to listen to me. So I just left. My mom and I haven't spoken since, and I haven't been back to that house. That was 5 years ago.